Hello there, my name is Dr. Delroy Hall. I'm a trained psychotherapist, have been for 30 years, and with recent events in COVID-19 and multiple deaths in many communities, very sudden as well, I thought I would just share a few ideas, some tips on dealing with grief and loss. Obviously this talk will be mainly about losing of a loved one, but there will be some overlap because loss is a huge topic, and certainly in loss in terms of health. For example, you're feeling well generally, but then over a period of time you feel unwell, you go to the doctor, they send you off to the hospital, you get the results back and you're told you've got a terminal illness. That's a loss. Loss of relationships, loss of job, employment, status, role, identity, loss of routine, people who lose the limbs, that's a loss. I was talking to somebody recently who's an academic and can't get access to her books, and she's almost grieving because she can't get to her books to read and to study. But also there is shattered dreams as well, whereby things haven't gone well and there's a huge disappointment. Things that were promised, hoped for, is not worked out whatsoever. But today I really will be talking about the loss of a loved one. In the Caribbean community, there's an event that we call Nine Night. It has some tradition, but it really is a gathering of people. When the person has passed, the community, people with friends go to the home, have food, so the person or the family are not left on their own, have food, celebrate with each other, look at photographs and have precious memories of this person. And then if the person had a faith position, we then go to the service. There's a huge celebration. There is mournfulness and there's grief, but there's a celebration of the person's life. And then those who can all go to the cemetery, and there's a service there, and the men in general, but women too, they help to backfill the grave, and all that is a part of a ritual and an ending, getting closure of this person's life. And all that has been wiped out with social distancing and not being able to meet people. I've suggested in one or two spaces that what you can do, those who are competent with using Zoom or other social platforms, that you can have a meal together via Zoom. So you meet together, somebody organises it in various parts of the country, you sit and eat together while you're having a Zoom. I've met friends for Zoom, for virtual coffee, and I don't see any reason why we can't have a virtual food or lunch or food together. Also, if it's possible, when you get to the cemetery, if the possible for the service, as short it is, to be live streamed, if you would have attended the funeral and you've got access to a phone and you can see the service, there's no reason why you can't dress up as if you were going to be at the funeral. So what that does, it kind of helps you to be there even though you're not there. So that's just one or two thoughts that I have that you may find helpful in terms of dealing with the loss. So in terms of dealing with loss, there's 5 stages of grief. I will be looking at 7, but there's 5 stages of grief. The person who really did a lot of work around it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and in her final book before she died in 2004, she said something very clear, that when she developed the stages, it wasn't to neatly package something that's really messy. So grieving is messy. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, it's messy, it's painful, but it was just a way of giving some understanding. So the first stage of grief is just shock and disbelief, where you've heard that the person has died, and I've said it myself. What are you talking about? I can't believe it. There's this shock, there's this kind of total kind of denial that this person has happened, or somehow the information just hasn't got in, it hasn't sunk in, so it doesn't kind of make sense. The second stage is denial, whereby you may have lost a loved one and somebody asks you how you are, and you say, I'm fine. I mean, in fact you're not, because there's lots of very painful emotions, but you don't know how to deal with it. So there's almost a denial of kind of what's taking place. The third stage is bargaining, whereby sometimes people say, if only I'd done this, or maybe had he gone to the doctor sooner, had I taken him to the doctor sooner, or had we not gone out that evening, the person wouldn't have contracted COVID-19 and so forth. So there's a lot of if onlys, and it links in really well to the next stage, which is guilt. this guilt in particular, if the person didn't want to go out, you said, look, come on, let's go out and just have some fun, and then the person contracts COVID-19, there can be a guilt surrounded by that. But guilt really plays a part for individuals who've lost a loved one through suicide or somebody taking their own life. You know, if only I'd done this, and maybe had I spent more time with them, and the night that I left early, had I stayed with them, they might not have done it. So there's this, all these emotions take place when somebody has died or lost in whatever way. The next stage is anger, which is a very common stage of dealing with grief. It could be angry at the person who's died, but we don't articulate that. How can we say that we're angry with the person who's died and left us in all this mess? And even if there's no mess, they've left you to get on with life, so there can be anger towards that. If there's been complications in the hospital, or if they died in hospital, there's anger towards the doctors, anger towards the nurses, anger towards the government, and certainly this time, if the medical staff had all the equipment, my partner wouldn't have died. Angry towards those who didn't get the PPE in on time, and angry towards society, and many people can be angry towards God. So that phase can be kind of passing, but it's about allowing people to kind of go through that. The next phase is depression. I guess it's an overspill of anger, and all these stages, you know, they're not fixed. They're fluid, they go backwards and forwards, and sometimes things can actually happen and it triggers something off again. There's also depression, as I said before, feeling low, but also there's acceptance and there's hope. You've got to the place now where you feel there's a recognition this person has died, and do you know what, I've got enough energy, I've got enough strength, I've got enough hope now that I can move forward with my life. And when I say move forward, you move on with grief. You don't leave it, but you move on with grief, and I'll say a little bit more about that a little bit later. So yeah, there's a few other things about grief which I'll not take any time up now, but just to mention, there's abnormal grief, compound, acute, complicated grief, whereby sometimes people are grieving and they're whining and pining for this person, and somehow they just can't move on. They're stuck. So the process of grieving takes anywhere between 6 months to 4 years, and maybe some people, even after the 4 years, they're still pining after the person, and it's beginning to interfere with their normal functioning of daily life and affecting the relationships in which they do have. The person I'd like to use this as a kind of launch pad is somebody called Dana Sparks, who has just written some stuff around dealing with loss and grief, and I've obviously developed it a little bit and added a few things to it, but it's really helpful in how he's actually how he's put it together, and it will help us as we move forward with this. First thing he said, which is absolutely important, and I can't emphasize that enough: give yourself the permission to feel. As I work as a counsellor, quite often the biggest problems in people's problems is the emotion that is evoked, and sometimes for some people it's really difficult to talk about the emotions that really grips them. But where loss and grief is concerned, even numbness, it's about being able to feel it. In another episode or series, I will say a little bit more about this. I will develop this point, but I'm just mentioning this at the moment. So give yourself the permission to feel. Secondly, write an unsent letter, or write unsent letters to this person. Unsent letters are very powerful activity that's used in bereavement counselling, whereby people write the person a letter. Obviously it can't be sent, but it's a way of expressing to the person how you feel, and sometimes it's a safe space in expressing how we feel, dependent on who we are, the type of role that we have in our community or society, in our workplace. Sometimes it's very difficult to talk to people how we really feel because people view us in a particular way. But the unsent letter is a marvellous way of dealing with very difficult emotions. I'll share a true story with you that happened to me quite a few years ago. I worked for the National Health Service as a senior counsellor, and I had a client who'd been referred to me. She was a nurse, and her husband at the time had died 7 years previously, and it got to the place whereby she was struggling in her life, struggling with work, struggling with her kind of immediate relationships, and so she was sent for counselling, or she was referred to counselling. She came, and as she sat down in the chair, she looked at me square in the eye and said, "This ain't going to work, you know." So when you hear a comment like that, you know that you're in for a hard time with you, the person you're going to work with. Anyway, we carried on in the first session, and I got a sense that she was angry, but she said she wasn't. But later on, she spoke about a screensaver which had her husband's face on it, and she said something, and how she said it, and the feeling that I got, I said to her, "Are you angry towards him?" She says, "Yes, I am." So I said, "Why are you angry?" She said, "I'd been with him, I'd nursed him for weeks, for months, and in the 5 minutes I go to the loo and I'm back and he died." She said, "I was so angry." And she'd kept that anger up for 7 years. It had affected her life. So counselling was difficult. I spoke to her about the unsent letter. She was very, very reluctant. One of the sessions was the anniversary of her husband passing, and she'd always taken that day off work. But I said, "Look, let's put it in. If you come, you come. If you don't, you don't. But let's see what happens." She turned up for counselling, and we spoke about the unsent letters again, and she deliberated, and then anyway, in the end, she did it. And she said to me, "Delroy, I cried all the way through it, but I'm so glad I did it. I feel so much better." What was in the letter, I don't know. That was her personal business. So she said, "I don't know what I'm going to do with the letter." And I don't know where this idea came from. I just said, "Have you thought about burning it and putting it in the container that his ashes are in?" She said, "Oh, what a great idea." And she did it. Came 2 weeks later, she said, "Delroy, I've met somebody." So now, I'm not saying every time you do an unsent letter you'll meet somebody, but the point I'm making is that this is a very powerful way of releasing unpleasant emotions that can get in the way of our normal functioning. The third thing is to journal about the positive memories. You know, when we think about the person who we've lost, positive memories is really important. In fact, just to go back to number 2 for a moment, one of the parts of the unsent letters can be feeling remorseful because you weren't with them when they died, or you weren't able to get to the service, or you weren't able to go to the cemetery. So all those things are kind of really important. Yeah, so journal about positive memories. It's really important to remember all the good times you had with this person. So write about them, and that helps with the kind of grieving process. The fourth thing, of course, is to talk to somebody. Find somebody who you can talk to, somebody you can trust, who won't think you're odd or strange by having some very unpleasant emotions. I would even go as far as to say, pay somebody. If you can't find anybody who you trust, who you could really be honest with and be open, pay somebody. One of the things that has alarmed me for many, many years, that for men in particular, we will spend thousands of pounds on our cars, but we won't spend a couple of £100 paying somebody to help us through a difficult situation, or to help us reset our lives so our futures can be a lot better than the past that we've had. I also like to say the fifth thing is that understand this, that grieving is universal. It's universal, but it's also very personal. Nobody can ever tell you how you should or shouldn't grieve. You grieve the way you grieve. You feel what you feel, and nobody has any right to tell you you shouldn't be feeling this or you should be feeling that. And certainly from a faith perspective, sometimes you'll almost feel as if to say that you shouldn't be grieving because you have faith. Somebody messaged me on Messenger on Facebook, said that when her sister died so suddenly, she felt by grieving that she was almost questioning her faith. No, that's not so at all. We are human beings and we feel deeply, and when we've lost somebody who we love, there's a huge chasm that it's left within us. Number 6 is lend a hand to somebody, a supportive ear to somebody. Maybe somebody you know, they're going through a tough time, maybe not as bad as yours, but just to listen to them, give them some time, helps you to take the focus off yourself, but you can help them, and that can really help a situation as well. One of the things I'll say here as well at this point is that children, it's really important, when children have lost a loved one, don't create stories. tell them the truth, but obviously you tell them the truth in a way in which they can understand. When we're not honest with children, one, they know, and secondly, this is what happens to many children more than we realise. They've lost a loved one, they feel dreadful, perhaps haven't got the words for it. Adults are not telling them what's taken place. They're feeling awful. Nobody's telling them anything to counteract this horrible feeling. They create a story in their head that matches the feeling. And one or two things can happen, well, many things can happen, but one or two things can happen. The child can grow up thinking and feeling guilty that they will cause the death of the person who's died. And secondly, they can grow up feeling bad, thinking that they are bad people. So it's really important where children are concerned that we don't beat around the bush, we don't not tell them because they're experiencing something. Be honest and open with them in a way in which they'll understand, and they will be able to grieve properly. The last thing he says, which I think is really important, prepare yourself for recurring grief. I think I've mentioned this before, but my father died 32 years ago, and a few weeks ago I was talking to my friend about him and I just burst into tears. 32 years on, can you imagine that? So be prepared for recurring grief. Also around anniversaries and holidays and special moments, it's good to have the knowledge that when you're coming up to these events, these moments, these times in the person's life, that you may feel a bit low, and you just know that actually it'll pass because today would have been his birthday, or today was the day they got this major promotion, or this is a place that we used to go on holiday. So be prepared that that will happen, and it can happen from time to time. I'd also say, be careful what we say to individuals. If you hear somebody say, have you not got over that yet? Very clearly they haven't gone through loss and grief. They really haven't, because if you do, you wouldn't say that because you know the pain of it. And for those of us from the faith community, and I'm speaking particularly from the Christian tradition, and I guess there's other traditions as well, the Apostle Paul spoke to the Christians he was writing to, don't grieve as those who have no hope. And I've heard too many of our ministers right across the board almost telling people not to grieve. But actually, if you're human, you will grieve if you've lost somebody. So it's perfectly natural and normal to grieve. Okay, there's a few more things I'd like to say within a church context. Well, COVID is not going to last forever. We will at some point return to the gathered community. But also for people going back to work, there's two things I'd like us to bear in mind. When we return, or when you go back to your gathered community, we can't just have business as usual and church as usual. There is a time for lament, a time where we bring our sorrows as a body of people, we bring our sorrows and pain and we offer it in prayer, through candles, through our songs, as a collective body, because this COVID has affected all of us. So there has to be a marking of this occasion as we bring our sorrows and grief into a place of worship. For the employers now, I'd be saying also, when your employees return, it can't be just business as usual, let's get on with it. There has to be an acknowledgement of what they've gone through, what you've gone through, what the business has gone through, what society has gone through. The moment has to be marked. It is too insignificant for us just to turn up on a Monday morning and clock on or clock in and then just to carry on work as usual. If the medical officer is right, our social distancing will be with us for up to the next year. So we can't carry on. So how might you do something at the beginning of maybe the first day of each day for the first week? You have a few minutes where you remember the suffering and the isolation and the confusion and the doubt and the fear that people have experienced while they've been working from home. What might you do just to acknowledge that? Within the Christian service, one of the things that we can do is have, when we have communion, that we're very specific about how we serve the bread and the wine, that the bread symbolizes all the things that we've gone through, and the consuming of the wine is looking to the future, looking forward to hope. So that can be a place of healing, a place of restoration, a place where we can be rejuvenated. And as we gather together, we think about our families, loved ones, the community, society, and the world, because the world has been ravaged by what's taken place. On a final note, though, I'd like to talk some things about self-care. That's kind of really important for those in the caring profession, pastors, ministers, social workers, caregivers of all description. This has affected all of us deeply. So whilst we're going through this, and after this, we're going to have to be really kind to ourselves where we can. So a few things I'd be saying: equip yourself with some knowledge about loss, grief and dying. At the moment, Open University has over 900 free courses. There is a course, I think it's called Death, Grief and Dying, 7 hours, and it's free, and it just equips us so we know, we can understand the whole process of dying and grief, what happens to people. And when we have the knowledge, quite often it can help us to be better practitioners, be better caregivers. A few other practical things as well. If you're working from home at the moment, turn your phone off. I know we're busy and lots of phone calls and so forth, but turn your phone off and give yourself a break. The other thing I would say, don't watch too much TV. If you watch the COVID news from morning till afternoon till night, you will end up feeling depressed. Maybe you just watch it once a day in the evening for updates. People from a faith tradition, there's a pastor couple I know, they watch the news once a day. Two things: most up to the updates, and then something to pray for. So please, if you want to watch the news, just once a day, because a lot of the stuff that we'll be hearing, it is repeated, but it has a way of kind of grating and draining our very spirits and mind. I'd also encourage you to keep, if you're not before, to start exercising. You need to get out to get some fresh air, just to raise our heart rate a little bit, just to keep our muscles moving. Also, I'd encourage us to be very careful with our diets, that we eat food that's nutritious. I know for lots of people there's a temptation when you're at home just to keep picking away at things, but it's about being able to exercise a form of discipline that we can do at the moment. So as I said, turn the TV off turn your phone off at some time, maybe turn the TV off as well, be occupied with something else. Even with the OU over 900 courses, maybe it's an opportunity to do a course or a study that you never normally would do. You wouldn't have the time to do it, but you do now. So just think about it. It's Open University, free courses, and it'll pop up, and there's lots of courses you can do just to keep yourself occupied during this time of lockdown. I wish you all the best. I wish you good health, good well-being psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physiologically, and every aspect of our being. I do wish you well. Thank you.